I still remember the morning he disappeared, the way sunlight streamed across the kitchen table while I sipped my coffee, the scent of toast lingering in the air, and how nothing about that day hinted at the emptiness that would soon swallow my life. One moment he was there, smiling, brushing his fingers over mine as he promised he'd be back soon, and the next he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a cold apartment and an unanswered phone. At first I thought it was temporary, maybe work, maybe a late meeting, maybe a surprise he wanted to give me. But as hours turned into days and then into weeks, the hope that had kept me clinging to normalcy began to dissolve. The police couldn't find him, there were no calls, no messages, and even his friends seemed to have no clue. The notebook he had left behind, once innocuous with scribbled reminders and mundane notes, now felt like a cryptic puzzle, hinting at a side of him I had never seen, a world I had never been invited into. Nights were the worst. I would sit by the window, staring at the street, imagining him walking down it, imagining his voice in the apartment, imagining any explanation that would make the absence bearable. My parents tried to comfort me, offering platitudes and prayers, but nothing patched the gaping wound of not knowing. Months passed. I moved through life like a ghost, the city around me familiar yet alien, every corner a reminder that he had once been a part of it and now he was gone. And then, just when I had convinced myself the story had ended years later, I saw her. His sister. She pulled up in a black luxury car, the kind of car that gleamed in the afternoon sun, immaculate, almost impossible. She stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her eyes meeting mine, a strange mix of familiarity and something unreadable, and she said just 2 words, "Get in." My heart slammed against my ribs. The city seemed to hold its breath. Questions I had buried rushed to the surface. Where has he been? Why did she appear now? And why does the fear in her eyes make my blood run cold? Without waiting for my response, she opened the passenger door, her hand gesturing firmly, insistently, as if hesitation was not an option. I paused, frozen in disbelief, torn between the safety of staying in my apartment and the unbearable pull of the truth I had spent years avoiding. I glanced back at my empty home, the memories of laughter, warmth, and love flooding through me, and then at her, at the car, at the promise of answers. I knew one thing. If I didn't follow her, I might never know why he had disappeared and I might never see him again. And as I slid into the seat beside her, the engine's low growl vibrating beneath me, I felt a cold, creeping realization that this ride wasn't just toward answers. It was toward a world I wasn't prepared for. A story of betrayal, secrets, and survival that would demand everything from me. And she didn't speak again until the car glided silently onto the highway, at which point she turned slightly and said, with a voice both calm and dangerous, "You're ready to know the truth, aren't you?" The message haunted me long after I read it, a silent accusation that pressed against the walls of my apartment and settled into my chest, cold and unyielding. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop the endless replay of his words, his touch, his smile, and the realization that they had been a lie, or at least a fragment of truth carefully curated to shield the reality from me. The unknown number had sent another text. "You need to see for yourself." My hands shook as I scrolled through the images attached. A gallery of moments I was never part of, captured in daylight, in shadows, in laughter I had never heard. There he was, my husband, calling her with the same tenderness he once reserved for me, whispering her name like it carried a universe only they could inhabit. And suddenly, every promise he had made to me became a chain of deceit I couldn't untangle. I felt the cold hollow of betrayal curl in my stomach as I realized that the years I had poured into love, loyalty, and marriage had existed beside a shadow, beside a secret life, a parallel devotion that had never been mine. My friends tried to console me, their words a soft murmur against the storm raging in my mind, but consolation felt impossible, inadequate, a thin veil over the raw wound of understanding that my life, my marriage, my trust, had been fractured long before I saw the proof. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted the truth, the unvarnished, brutal reality, and I knew that to face it I would have to confront him, to walk into the very space that had once been sacred and now threatened to consume me with its lies. The next day I found myself standing outside the cafe where they met, watching from a distance as they laughed, sharing the same glances I once believed belonged only to me, and the ache in my chest was sharp enough to double me over, yet it carried a strange clarity. I understood then that love was not always ownership, that promises could be illusions, and that the man I had married had chosen a path that intersected with mine only in fragments, only in moments, leaving me to reconcile affection with absence, presence with betrayal. My hands trembled as I held my phone, thinking of confronting him, but a deeper fear gripped me. The fear that revelation would not heal, that confrontation might destroy what remained of the fragile bond, if anything remained at all. And yet, something in me demanded engagement, demanded understanding, demanded a reckoning I could not ignore. I arranged a meeting, my mind swirling with every possible scenario, rehearsing words, emotions, and reactions, knowing that the encounter would be decisive, a threshold beyond which nothing could remain the same. When he arrived, there was a flicker of recognition, a hesitation, an unspoken acknowledgement that the truth was finally out. I looked at him, searching for remnants of the man I loved, the warmth that had drawn me to him, and yet the shadow of her presence lingered like smoke in a room that refused to clear. I demanded to know everything, the feelings, the history, the choices, and he spoke carefully, meticulously, his voice soft but heavy with guilt, explaining how love had divided him, how circumstances had intertwined his heart with another without diminishing his bond with me, how his mind and soul had carried both affections in a tension that had become unbearable. I listened, heart pounding, a mix of rage, sorrow, and incredulity flooding me, realizing that the life I had imagined, the marriage I had invested in, had been a delicate theater of duality, with my happiness and his secrets entwined in ways I had never anticipated. And even as I absorbed his words, I felt a strange sense of awakening, a clarity that came from seeing the truth, however painful, however disruptive, however shattering it was to the core of my identity, my trust, and my love. But before I could fully process the implications, a knock came at the cafe door, subtle yet deliberate, and I turned to see someone familiar, someone I never expected, someone whose presence promised to deepen the revelations yet further. My heart skipped, my pulse accelerated, and I realized in that instant that the story was far from over, that the confrontation was only the beginning, and that the truths I sought would demand courage, resilience, and a reckoning I had not yet prepared myself for. And as the figure approached, a chill ran down my spine, a premonition that the next revelation would not only challenge my perception of him but also redefine everything I believed about love, loyalty, and betrayal. The figure that approached the cafe table stopped just beyond the window, and I recognized her immediately, the other woman, her expression calm yet carrying a quiet curiosity, a sense of inevitability that made my stomach tighten. She didn't speak, only waited, eyes flicking toward him and then toward me, and in that moment, the air between us became thick with unspoken truths, the tension almost physical, pressing down, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to separate the past from the present. I wanted to retreat, to run, to leave before this collision of hearts, emotions, and betrayals could completely unravel me, but I couldn't. Something inside me demanded confrontation, demanded understanding, demanded that I see the entire landscape of his divided love laid bare. He stood, conflicted, torn, the man I thought I knew fractured by the reality that my marriage had never been the sole narrative of his heart. I watched him carefully, searching for answers in gestures, in the tremor of his hands, in the way his eyes met mine and then flickered away, and I realized that love had not been simple, that the entanglement was deeper than betrayal alone, and that the consequences of these hidden affections would ripple through every moment of our lives from this day forward. She spoke first, quietly, addressing me directly, explaining the nuances, the history, the choices, the inevitability of her connection with him, and I listened, incredulous and heartbroken, yet unable to turn away. And then he began, revealing in painstaking detail how he had loved both of us, how the lines between duty, passion, and attachment had blurred over time, how the desire to protect, to maintain, and to avoid conflict had guided his silence, his divided affections, and his careful manipulation of circumstances. Every word cut through me, a mix of sorrow, anger, and reluctant understanding, as I realized that the man who had called me wife had been living in a dual reality, and that his promises, though sincere in one sense, had been incomplete, partial, a reflection of the impossibility of loving fully in secrecy. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand justice, to reclaim what had been mine, but I also understood the human complexity before me, the fear, the guilt, the emotional fractures that had dictated his choices, and the ways in which love can be imperfect, even devastatingly so. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was seconds, as the truth poured forth, layer upon layer, revealing the interconnections, the heartbreak, the mistakes, the longing, and the attempts at reconciliation that had never succeeded until now. And through it all, I felt my own transformation, the awakening of a self that had been patient, loyal, loving, yet now forced to reckon with the stark reality of imperfection, duality, and the profound consequences of human desire. But the confrontation was not yet over. Just as the weight of revelation seemed almost unbearable, a new message arrived on my phone, short, urgent, cryptic. "There's more you need to know, and it's not safe here." A cold wave of fear washed over me, and I realized that the emotional confrontation, as consuming as it was merely the precursor to a deeper, more urgent truth. A danger I hadn't anticipated, a reality beyond heartbreak, a series of consequences that could not be ignored. I looked at both of them, my heart heavy, mind racing, body tense, knowing that what came next would define not only the future of our relationships but the very narrative of trust, betrayal, and survival that had been building since the day he first called me wife. And even as anger, sorrow, and disbelief threatened to consume me, I felt a strange clarity emerging, a sense that I had reached a pivotal moment where choices, courage, and understanding would converge, and that the path forward, though uncertain and fraught, demanded engagement, not retreat. And as we left the cafe, walking into the late afternoon light, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, that the story of our love, betrayal, and survival had entered a new phase, and that the next steps would determine whether healing, reconciliation, or devastation awaited. My pulse quickened, my breath caught, and I whispered silently to myself, bracing for the revelations that would define the final act, knowing that the journey of heartbreak, truth, and emotional reckoning was far from over. The days after that cafe meeting felt like walking through a storm that had no end, the wind battering at my chest with every thought of him, of her, of the life I thought I knew. I moved through the apartment mechanically, going through routines that suddenly seemed absurd, meaningless. His presence lingered even in absence, in the smell of his cologne on the coat he hadn't worn for days, in the untouched cup he always left by the sink. I kept replaying their words, the delicate balance of truth and partial lies, the way he had tried to justify himself, to frame his divided love as unavoidable, and every explanation, every reasoning only deepened the ache inside me. I felt betrayed not just by his choices, but by the carefully constructed illusions I had lived in for years, believing in a marriage that had always been incomplete, partial, hidden. And yet, even in that despair, a flicker of understanding persisted. I could see now that he had struggled too, trapped between love and desire, between duty and passion, unable to reconcile the halves of a heart that had been stretched too thin. But understanding did not erase pain. The nights were the hardest, long, silent, punctuated only by memories and imagined confrontations. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone could love two people at once, how promises could coexist with secrecy, and why the truth had been hidden until now. I tried to speak with him again, to find a path toward resolution, toward clarity, toward something resembling peace, but every conversation seemed to circle back to the same words, the same justifications, the same fragile reasoning that only highlighted the impossibility of the situation. The other woman remained a shadow at the edge of every thought, a presence I could not ignore, whose existence had become a symbol of the fractures in my marriage, the unspoken truths, and the realities I had tried so hard to deny. And yet she was not the enemy. It was the secrecy, the betrayal of trust, the illusions that had been sold as love, that had become the fracture line splitting everything I thought I knew. I began to see myself differently in those days, a woman forced to reckon with the complexities of human emotion, the contradictions of love, and the necessity of choosing between despair and self-preservation. I realized that my identity, my self-worth, and my future could not be bound to the divided affections of a man who had loved partially, secretly, and imperfectly. And as I made this realization, a sense of strength began to build, fragile at first, then steadily growing as I understood that survival was not only physical but emotional, spiritual, and psychological. I began to map the steps I would need to reclaim my sense of self, to rebuild my life around truth rather than illusion, and to confront the man I had once called husband with clarity, courage, and resolve. One evening he came to me, vulnerability etched into his face, remorse softening the edges of his expression. He admitted finally that he had made mistakes he could not undo, that his love had been divided, but that he had never meant to harm me intentionally, and that his deepest desire had been to navigate impossible circumstances while preserving as much of our bond as he could. I listened, torn between empathy and anger, between longing and the necessity of detachment, realizing that the path forward would not be simple, that forgiveness would not be immediate, and that the emotional work required to survive this revelation was immense. And just as I began to sense a fragile understanding forming between us, a knock at the door shattered the quiet tension, a reminder that life, consequences, and truths waited beyond the intimate space of our reconciliation. When I opened the door, a package lay at my feet, anonymous, unmarked, but heavy with the weight of implication. Inside were documents, photographs, and letters that revealed deeper secrets, evidence that his divided love was only a fragment of a larger tapestry of betrayal and choices, a web I had not fully seen before. My heart raced, my hands shook, and I realized that the journey through heartbreak, truth, and betrayal was far from over. The revelations demanded action, courage, and discernment, and I understood in that instant that I could no longer remain passive, no longer exist in the delicate balance of ignorance and hope. The choices I made next would define not only the remnants of my marriage but the trajectory of my life, my sense of self, and my understanding of love, trust, and betrayal. And as I stared at the documents, tracing the lines of deceit, the hidden connections, and the truths I had not known, I felt the full weight of the situation press down on me. I whispered to myself, steadying my trembling hands, knowing that the climax of this story, the resolution of love, betrayal, and survival, was near, and that what came next would demand everything I had left to give. The documents and photographs lay before me, a cruel mosaic of truths, half-truths, and omissions that stretched across the years I had believed we shared. I ran my fingers over the edges of the papers as though touch alone could help me absorb the weight of everything, the intricate web of betrayals, choices, and secret desires that had guided his life and intersected so devastatingly with mine. My husband's face appeared in my mind, shifting between the man I loved, the one who had called me wife, and the stranger who had hidden a parallel life for years. I realized that the man I had waited for, grieved for, and hoped to reconcile with was also a man trapped by circumstance, fear, and human imperfection. I needed to see him, to understand the full context, to demand answers that went beyond whispered explanations, half-truths, and silent apologies. When he arrived, the mansion felt heavy with tension, the air thick as if it carried the cumulative weight of our shared history, and I could feel the shift in energy, the unspoken understanding that this moment was pivotal. I asked questions, many questions, and he answered not defensively, but with the careful deliberation of someone who had navigated dangerous emotional terrain for years. Each revelation pulled me deeper into a labyrinth of feelings: sorrow for the lost time, anger at the secrecy, disbelief at the duality of his affections, and an emerging sense of clarity that allowed me to separate the man I loved from the choices he had made. The other woman entered our space not as an adversary, but as a necessary witness to the tangled emotions, a living reminder of the complexity of human desire, attachment, and imperfection. Her presence was both soothing and infuriating. I felt jealousy and empathy at once, a tangled knot of emotion I had never experienced before. And yet, even in that chaos, I sensed a fragile thread of resolution forming, a possibility that truth, once fully confronted, could lead to understanding, reconciliation, or at least acceptance. Hours passed as we spoke, revealed, and reflected, until the mansion was silent except for the soft hum of the city beyond. I realized that forgiveness, if it came, would not be instant, and that healing required more than words. It required courage, boundaries, and a willingness to face the uncomfortable reality of human imperfection. Just as I felt the first flicker of relief, my phone vibrated. Another message, cryptic and urgent: "You need to leave now." Something beyond emotional betrayal was coming, something that threatened the fragile equilibrium we had begun to construct. I felt my chest tighten as I realized the story was far from over, that the final layers of truth and consequence were still waiting to be revealed. And as I looked at him, the man who had called me wife yet loved another, I knew that the path ahead demanded courage I hadn't yet fully measured, and that survival, love, and understanding would be tested in ways I could scarcely imagine. The message had been clear: leave now. The urgency, though delivered through mere words on a screen, carried a weight that pressed into my chest, making every thought sharp, every heartbeat uneven. I moved quickly, gathering what I could, the mansion's opulent interiors now a backdrop to the storm of fear and determination coursing through me. My husband followed, silent but tense, his eyes flicking toward shadows, toward exits, toward the city beyond that seemed to hum with danger I could not yet see. The other woman, surprisingly calm, guided me through secret corridors, explaining only enough for me to move without hesitation, her voice low, measured, and strangely reassuring. As we stepped into the sleek car waiting outside, the luxury of it seemed almost absurd against the urgency, the threat that had materialized suddenly without warning. I couldn't help but reflect on the irony. The life I had built, the marriage I had trusted, and the love I had clung to, all existed now under a tension so severe that it felt like a tangible presence pressing down on me. The streets blurred past as the driver navigated with precision, taking routes I had never seen, through hidden alleys and quiet avenues, each turn a calculated maneuver that reminded me of the careful orchestration of secrecy, love, and betrayal that had defined the years I had shared with him. My mind spun with questions not just about the immediate danger, but about the life we had, the choices made, and the ways in which love could be fractured, divided, and yet survive in some form. My husband finally spoke, his voice low, filled with the gravity of the situation. There were consequences far beyond our emotions that had intersected with our lives, secrets that had been kept to protect us both, and yet which had now manifested in ways that demanded immediate action. I felt fear, yes, but also a strange exhilaration. The sharp, undeniable clarity that came when survival, love, and truth converge in a single urgent moment. As we arrived at a safe house, small, secluded, and fortified, I realized the magnitude of what I had been shielded from and simultaneously, the depth of my own resilience. The other woman remained at my side, no longer a rival in my eyes but a companion in understanding, someone who had endured her own heartache, her own longing, and whose presence now grounded me in the reality that human emotions are rarely simple, linear, or fair. We spent hours in quiet reflection, piecing together the paths that had led to this point, reconciling the layers of betrayal, divided love, and secrecy with the necessity of survival and clarity. I felt myself growing stronger with each revelation, understanding that my identity, my agency, and my future could not remain tethered to a man who had loved partially and hidden his truth for years. I realized then that reclaiming myself meant more than confronting him, more than navigating the web of deception. It meant embracing the woman I had become through pain, heartbreak, and endurance. And yet, just as I felt the first flicker of empowerment, a sudden noise outside the safe house, a sharp knock, deliberate and forceful, reminded me that danger had not fully receded. My pulse raced, adrenaline sharpening every sense as I moved to the window and glimpsed shadows moving in the dim light. The stakes, I realized, extended beyond emotional betrayal to survival, and that the decisions I made in the next moments would determine not just the outcome of my marriage or my heart, but my very life. My husband stood beside me, eyes alert, hands steady but tense, acknowledging silently that the confrontation was far from over, that the consequences of hidden desires, secrets, and past mistakes could manifest in ways we had not fully anticipated. I took a deep breath, steadying my trembling hands, feeling the resilience I had cultivated over years of loss and revelation rise to the surface. And I knew that whatever awaited us, I would face it with the clarity, courage, and determination that had carried me this far. And as the shadows pressed closer, I whispered silently to myself, feeling the full weight of survival, love, and truth converge, knowing that the ultimate reckoning, the confrontation, the resolution, and the reclamation of my life, was imminent. The night was heavy with anticipation, each shadow cast by the dim streetlights outside the safe house carrying the weight of the months, years, and unspoken truths that had led me to this moment. I felt every heartbeat like a drum counting down to an inevitable reckoning. My husband stood beside me, a man transformed by absence, secrecy, and the consequences of his divided affections, his eyes revealing both remorse and the quiet strength forged by surviving the complexities of his own choices. The other woman, once a symbol of betrayal, now seemed almost a part of the mosaic that defined this strange, fractured family we had become. Her calm determination a reflection of the difficult paths we all had walked to arrive at this threshold. Outside, the shadows moved closer, but I no longer felt paralyzed by fear. Instead, I felt a deep, anchoring clarity. I had survived heartbreak, betrayal, secrecy, and uncertainty, and I had emerged with a consciousness sharpened by adversity, a sense of self reclaimed from the cracks where doubt and despair had once thrived. My mind traced back through every revelation, every confrontation, every tear and tremor of anger, every whispered apology and every hidden truth. I understood now that love is rarely linear, rarely neat, rarely confined to one form, and that the fractures in relationships do not necessarily signify failure, but rather the challenge of navigating imperfect hearts in an imperfect world. The knock on the door came again, insistent, echoing through the quiet house, and I realized it was time to confront the remaining threats, to face the practical consequences of the secrets that had so long governed our lives. We opened the door together, and the night air hit us, cool and real, carrying with it the tangible reminder that life continues beyond fear and betrayal. The figures outside were finally revealed, not monsters, but men and women whose presence had been shadowed by circumstance, whose intentions were complicated, intersecting with loyalty, greed, and unfinished business. Words were exchanged, truths unveiled, and I felt the emotional and practical weight of survival settle into a resolution of sorts. Clarity, understanding, and the acknowledgement that we had faced what was inevitable and emerged intact. My husband reached for my hand, an acknowledgement of shared endurance, of love imperfect but present, and in that touch I recognized not the man who had deceived me, but the man who had lived through fear, choices, and consequences alongside me. The other woman nodded quietly, her own journey reflected in her eyes, a reminder that human hearts are capable of multiplicity, of resilience, and of grace in the wake of betrayal. And as the night finally gave way to dawn, the light spilling over the city streets, I felt an expansive sense of rebirth, a recognition that the pain, heartbreak, and revelation had forged me into someone stronger, someone aware, someone unafraid to navigate love, betrayal, and truth on her own terms. I looked at the fragments of our past, the web of secrets and choices, and I realized that closure is not always found in perfection, but in acceptance, understanding, and the courage to step forward into the unknown with eyes wide open. My husband and I stood together, a fragile but genuine connection renewed, tempered by honesty and the unshakable reality that love, when tested, can survive, not unscathed but alive. The other woman stepped back, her presence no longer a threat but a quiet acknowledgement of the truths we all had to endure. And in that final quiet moment, I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of years lift slightly, the tension of secrets dissolve, and the clarity of survival and emotional reclamation settle within me. The city woke beyond the windows, indifferent yet beautiful, and I understood that my life, though shaped by betrayal and imperfection, was mine to own, mine to rebuild, mine to navigate with courage and self-awareness. I whispered to myself, steady, reflective, and resolute, knowing that the journey of love, heartbreak, and survival had reached a point of cinematic closure, a moment of rebirth where pain, understanding, and hope converged. The past had shaped me, the betrayals had tested me, but the dawn had arrived, and I was ready to step into a life defined not by deception, but by clarity, strength, and the courage to love and survive on my own terms. Please follow me for no reason.